Hello everyone, I am Dr. Deepak Kumar, Assistant Professor in the Department of History at the BHOPAL School of Social Sciences. In this series of lecture on the constitutional history of India, today we are going to discuss the Indian Council Act of 1892. This act was a significant piece of legislation enacted by the British Parliament that aimed to reform the governance in British India. It marked an important stage in the constitutional evolution of British India. Now, if you remember, before 1858, when India was being governed by the British East India Company, there were two factors which were exercising check on the government of India. These were the wholesome jealousy felt by the Parliament towards the company as a privileged corporation. The second one was the necessity for the renewal of the charter at the end of every 20 years, in which they inquired the Indian affairs and brought some changes and reforms. Now, from 1858, these two factors or these two safeguards disappeared, and after the transfer, the parliamentary control over Indian affairs became a sham. However, the conditions in India were undergoing a swift change. A great social and religious reform movement began with the activities of Raja Ram Mohan Rai, Swami Dayanand Saraswati and Mrs. Annie Besant. Their social and religious reform movement paved the way for the emergence of Indian national movement under the Indian National Congress. Also, the progress in railways and telegraphs brought new ideas from the West. Now, at the same time, establishment of universities at Bombay, Calcutta and Madras helped in the political awakening. Now, these changes can also be observed in the presidential address of the Congress. Shri Vomesh Chandra Banerjee, in his first presidential address in the very first session of the Congress in 1885 held at Calcutta, observed the desire of the people of India to be governed. He says, according to the ideas of government prevailing in Europe, was in no way incompatible with their thorough loyalty to the British government. All that they desired was that the basis of the government should be widened and that the people should have their proper and legitimate share in it. Similarly, Dadabhai Naoroji, in the second session of the Indian National Congress held at Bombay in 1886, demanded to introduce the elective element in the legislature of the country. He says, whatever acts the governments pass do not quite please us. We, whether rightly or wrongly, grumble against the government and the government only. Under these dynamic changes, the bill was presented in House of Lords in 1890 and it was passed as an act in the year 1892. Now let's discuss the provisions of this act. The provisions of this act achieved mainly three things. These were, first, it increased the number of additional members in central and provincial legislative council. Second, it introduced the elective principle in the guise of nomination on the basis of recommendation. Third, it enlarged the function of the council. Now let's discuss these provisions in detail. Regarding the central legislature, the act says the Governor General's Legislative Council was to contain not less than 10 and not more than 16 nominated members. And out of these 16 additional members, 10 were to be non-officials, of whom 4 were to be appointed on the recommendations of the non-official members of the 4 provincial legislature and 1 on the recommendation of the Calcutta Chambers of Commerce, while the remaining 5 were to be nominated by the Viceroy to represent landed and other interests of the country. Regarding the provincial legislature, the Act says that the number of additional members was to be not less than 8 and not more than 20, especially in the case of Bombay and Madras Council, while the maximum for the Council of Bengal was fixed at 20, and for that of Northwestern Province, it was fixed at 15. The majority of the members added to the provincial councils were to be non-officials. They were to be nominated on the recommendations made by principal and district boards and chambers of commerce, landlords and universities. Regarding the provisions about the elective principle. The Act says technically all the additional members were nominated by the Governor General or the Lieutenant Governor or the Governor, as the case may have been. It was, however, an indirect election. Only the members recommended by the Calcutta Chambers of Commerce can be said to have been directly elected. Now, in the acceptance of this principle of election lies the momentous character of the reforms introduced by the Act of 1892. Regarding the function of the legislature, the Act enlarged the powers of the legislative appreciably. They were authorized to discuss the annual budget, but without the right to vote on it or to divide the House on any issue connected with it. It also enabled the non-official members to discuss and criticize the government, and also gave the government an opportunity to defend and explain any misgiving or any misunderstanding. The Act also gave the members the right to ask questions. Now, this is very significant, but especially on matters of public interest, but had no power to ask supplementary questions. As a result of these powers, the Council became something more than more legislative or advisory bodies, as they were under the Act of 1861. So, these were the provisions or the major provisions. Now, let us discuss the advancements of this Act on that of 1861. Now, the authors of the report on Indian constitutional reforms is very significant, and we can observe the significance of this Act in this report. The report says, whereas in 1861 men said, we had better hear what a few Indians of our choosing have to say about our laws. Now, in 1889 they were saying, our laws have positively benefited by Indian advice and criticism. Let us have more of it, and if possible, let the people choose the men they send to advise us. This is very significant, as can be seen in the report. Now, to evaluate this Act, let us discuss the evaluation of the Act of 1892. The provisions of the Act were criticized by the Congress at several successive sessions. Now, if we look at this Act retrospectively, we can observe that they were trifling. Similarly, even at that time, people were criticizing this Act. It was failed to appease the Indians. Mr. Firoz Shah Mehta, who was the president of the 1890 session, which was held at Calcutta, described this bill as most halting and unsatisfactory. On the similar lines, Mr. Surendranath Banerjee, who presided at the 1895 Pune session, declared that the Congress was not satisfied with it. In spite of all these shortcomings, the Act of 1892 was a decided advance upon that of 1861, especially the introduction of the elective principle. We can say that this Act was the seed sown in 1892, which at much later date sprouted and grew into a larger tree. The Act also gave opportunities to distinguished Indians like Gopal Krishna Gokhale and Firoz Shah Mehta, who did a splendid work in their respective fields, especially in the Supreme Legislative Council. Also to S.N. Banerjee and Anand Mohan Bose in Bengal. It also gave opportunity to C. Vijay Raghav Chariyar and N. Subaran Pantulu in Madras, to Shri Sir Chimanlal Setalwad and Sir Gokul Das Parekh in Bombay, to Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya in the United Province. Now, let me give you a brief gist of this Act. Before 1892, Indians were demanding especially to expand the legislature. They were also demanding to introduce an elective principle. They were demanding the power to ask questions, and they were also demanding to have a say in the budget. Now, the 1892 Act responded with these things. The legislature seats increased, 6 elected and 24 nominated. The elective principle was brought, but it was an indirect election. The power to ask question was also discussed. They responded with that question as that members can ask question but no supplementary question. Regarding the budget completely remained in the hand of the government. Here is a breakdown of the expanded legislature. The legislature had the maximum number of nominated people, and these how they nominated. At the central level, the members of the Central Legislative Council were nominated by the Viceroy on the recommendation of the Provincial Legislative Council and the Bengal Chambers of Commerce. On the provincial level, the members of the Provincial Legislative Council were nominated by the governors on the recommendation of district boards, municipalities, universities, trade associations, zamindars and chambers. So these were the important aspects of the Indian Council Act of 1892. Thank you.